I need to write this down. I need to get it out of my head and into the world, because I don't think I'm going to be able to get a scientific paper published on what I found. I have no proof, no samples, no photos. Everything is at the bottom of a river somewhere in the miles of unmarked wilderness that makes up the northern edge of the state. All I have is the memory and the new, creeping fear of the potted plants in my own apartment. My field is botany. Specifically, I'm obsessed with extremophiles and symbiotic ecosystems, plants that thrive where they shouldn't, forming relationships with fungi and bacteria to create their own isolated worlds. I spend most of my time online, scoring obscure forums and digitized university archives for whispers of strange flora. That's how I found the lead. It was a post on a forgotten message board for wilderness survivalists dated over a decade ago. A user, now deleted, wrote a rambling post about getting lost while hunting. He described stumbling into a small, isolated valley where the plants weren't right. He talked about a sweet, sickly smell that clung in the air and a spongy, red-tinted soil he'd never seen before. He fled when night fell, convinced the place was haunted. He provided a hand-drawn map with crude landmarks. It was dismissed by other users as a tall tale, the product of dehydration and panic. But his descriptions, stripped of the supernatural paranoia, were intriguing. A unique soil composition, a dominant unidentified flora. This was the kind of thing a young botanist dreams of. Discovering an entirely new, self-contained ecosystem could make my career. I spent a month cross-referencing his map with satellite imagery and topographical surveys. I found it. A tiny bowl-shaped depression in the forest, miles from any trail, surrounded by impenetrable ridges on 3 sides. It was a perfect geographic isolation chamber. I packed for a 3-day solo expedition. GPS, sample kits, soil testing equipment, a high-resolution camera, and enough preserved food to last a week if I got into trouble. I told my friends I was going camping. I didn't want anyone else horning in on my discovery until I had it properly documented. The first day of the hike was standard. The familiar, comfortable solitude of the deep woods. The air was clean. The sounds were of birds and the rustle of small animals. By the second day, as I left the marked trails and began navigating by compass and GPS, the forest began to change. The birdsong faded. The undergrowth became thicker, stranger. The usual ferns and mosses were replaced by pale, rubbery-looking fungi and thick, thorny vines I didn't recognize. The silence was profound. By noon on the second day, I smelled it. A faint, sweet scent on the air. It was cloying, like overripe fruit and funeral flowers. It was both beautiful and nauseating. I knew I was close. I pushed through a final, dense wall of the strange thorny vines, the thorns snagging at my clothes like tiny, grasping fingers. And then I stepped out onto the shadows and into the grove. My first coherent thought was, I'm going to be famous. It was the most alien and beautiful place I had ever seen. The grove was small, maybe 2 acres, nestled in the bottom of the valley. The light here was different, hazy and golden, filtered through a canopy of broad, waxy leaves from trees I couldn't identify. The ground wasn't soil, not really. It was a soft, spongy carpet of deep crimson moss that yielded under my boots like flesh. And the plants? The plants were a biological impossibility. Thick serpentine vines, as thick as my arm, snaked across the grove floor. They were a pale, almost translucent white, and I could see a network of darker veins just beneath the skin. As I watched, mesmerized, I saw them move. A slow, rhythmic pulse beat through them, a wave of contraction that traveled the entire length of the vine. One pulse, every few seconds, like a heartbeat. I knelt, my scientific mind racing. Some kind of advanced hydraulic system for nutrition transport. A new form of turgor pressure? It was revolutionary. And then there were these flowers. They grew in clusters, sprouting from the crimson moss on long, slender stems. They had no petals in the traditional sense. They looked, for all the world, like skeletal human hands reaching up from the ground. They were beautiful in a terrifying sculptural way. As I watched, one of the hands slowly, gracefully clenched into a fist, then just as slowly unfurled again. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was mimicry, I told myself. A complex evolutionary trait to deter herbivores or attract a specific, unknown pollinator. I spent the next few hours in a state of euphoric disbelief. I was a biologist stepping onto a new planet. I took hundreds of photos, filled pages of my notebooks with sketches and detailed observations. The air was thick with that sweet, heavy scent, and I felt a little lightheaded, a little dizzy, but I chalked it up to the altitude and the excitement. The rhythmic pulsing of the veins became a soothing, constant backbeat to my work. The slow clenching and unclenching of the hand flowers was a hypnotic, silent dance. I had documented everything I could see from the perimeter. It was time to get my hands dirty. I needed a soil sample, a core that would tell me what this incredible place was made of. I unpacked my trowel and sample bags and found a spot near the center of the grove. The crimson moss was cool and damp to the touch. I took a deep breath, the cloying scent filling my lungs, and plunged the trowel into the ground. It was like digging into a dense, cold sponge. There was no grit, no resistance from pebbles or roots, just a soft, fibrous parting of the material. I was so focused on the strangeness of the soil that I almost didn't see the movement at the far edge of the grove. He was standing there. Or it was the gardener. It had emerged from the shadows of the unidentifiable trees so silently that I didn't notice. It was tall, impossibly slender, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was the pale, smooth white of a mushroom, and it was completely hairless. It wore no clothes. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a dancer's poise that was at odds with its alien physique. It had a head, but no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, blank expanse of pale skin. I froze, my trowel buried in the ground, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I was hidden behind a cluster of the hand flowers, and the creature hadn't seen me. It seemed utterly absorbed in its work. It drifted through its garden, its long, three-fingered hands caressing the pulsing vines, adjusting the leaves of the canopy. I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of terror and scientific curiosity, as it stopped at one of the clusters of hand flowers. It raised one of its own hands. From the tip of its long, slender middle finger, a single, needle-sharp black thorn extended. With a slow, ritualistic movement, it pricked the skin of its own forearm. A single drop of clear, viscous fluid welled up. It was not blood. The gardener let the drop fall onto the crimson moss at the base of the flower. As the sap soaked in, the five-fingered flower seemed to respond, its appendages unfurling, reaching towards the spot. The creature was feeding its garden. From itself. My mind was a whirlwind. Symbiosis? Was the gardener a part of the ecosystem? An animal that had co-evolved to cultivate these plants? It then moved to one of the thick, pulsing vines. From a sheath of its hip, it produced a small, sharp tool made of what looked like obsidian. It gently, almost lovingly, pruned a small, leaf-like offshoot from the vine. Where the cut was made, the vine bled. A thick, dark red fluid, identical in color and consistency to blood, oozed out and dripped onto the crimson moss below. The gardener watched until the bleeding stopped, then moved on. I had to get out of there. This went beyond an undocumented ecosystem. This was something else. Something ancient and deeply wrong. But I couldn't leave without the sample. The scientist in me screamed that I needed proof. I turned my attention back to my trowel, resolving to be quick and silent. I dug deeper. The soft, fibrous material was dense. About 6 inches down, my trowel hit something. It wasn't a rock. The impact was soft, yielding. A root, I thought. A large tuber. I used my hands, scooping up away the crimson soil to get a better look. My fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. I cleared some of the soil. I saw the gentle curve of a forehead. a closed eyelid fringed with pale lashes, the bridge of a nose. My breath caught in my throat. A strangled, gagging sound escaped my lips. It was a human face, perfectly preserved, its expression serene, peaceful. It was looking up at me from its shallow grave. The world tilted. The sweet scent in the air suddenly felt like a poison, a narcotic to keep the residents of this garden calm and placid in their final resting place. The soft, spongy ground, the crimson color. It wasn't moss. It was compost. A rich, loamy, perfectly decomposed bed of human bodies. My eyes shot around the grove, seeing it for the first time. The pulsing vines were connected to hearts deep within the compost, pumping blood and nutrients through a grotesque living vascular system. The beautiful handflowers were growing directly from the buried arms of the dead, animated by some unholy biological process. This was a harvest, a beautifully arranged, meticulously tended living graveyard. The rhythmic pulsing of the vines, the soothing beat that had filled the grove, stopped. All of it. The entire garden went silent. Across the grove, the gardener, for the first time, ceased its work. It stood perfectly still. Then slowly, with an unnatural smoothness, its featureless head turned. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze lock onto my location with an absolute, terrifying certainty. Then came the sound. From all around me, a soft rustling whisper. I looked down. The handflowers, all of them, the dozens and dozens of pale, reaching hands had turned on their stems. Every single one of them was now pointing directly at me. The pulsing began again. Not the slow, steady beat from before, but a frantic, accelerating rhythm. It was the sound of 100 hearts suddenly beating in terror or in rage. It was the sound of an alarm. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat. I scrambled backwards, abandoning my trowel, my sample kit. I got to my feet and I ran. I crashed through the thorny vines, not caring as they tore at my skin and clothes. Behind me, I could hear the gardener moving. It was a slow, deliberate stride. It didn't need to be fast. It was relentless. The forest itself had become my enemy. The sweet, disorientating scent was everywhere now, thicker than smoke, making my head swim and my vision blur. The very plants seemed to have turned against me. Vines I hadn't noticed before, with broad, 5-lobed leaves shaped like open hands, seemed to reach for me, wrapping around my ankles, trying to trip me. I ran blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline. The rhythmic, heart-like thumping seemed to be coming from the ground beneath my feet, a sound I couldn't escape. I could feel the gardener's presence behind me, not close, but constant, an inevitability. It would not tire. It would not stop. Just when my lungs felt like they were going to burst and my legs were about to give out, I heard a new sound. The sound of running water. I burst through a final line of trees and saw it, a river, wide and fast-moving. It was my only chance. Without a second thought, I leaped. The shock of the cold water was a violent, welcome slap back to reality. The current was strong, and it grabbed me, pulling me downstream, tumbling me over rocks, away from that cursed valley. I lost my backpack with my camera, my notes, and my GPS. Everything. The last thing I saw as I was swept around a bend was the tall, pale figure of the gardener, standing impassively on the riverbank, its featureless face turned towards me, watching me go. I don't know how long I was in the water. I washed up miles downstream, bruised, hypothermic, and half drowned. It took me another day of walking to find a road. I flagged down a logging truck, and the driver took me to the nearest town. I used a payphone at a diner to call my friends, telling them I had an accident and lost all my gear. I didn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? I'm back in my apartment now. It's been a week. I'm safe, but I'm not really. The scratches from the thorny vines have healed, but I feel like they left something behind. I can't get the sweet, cloying smell out of my nose. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I can hear a faint rhythmic pulsing in the walls. And my plants. My apartment is full of them. Ferns, succulents, a big fiddle leaf fig in the corner. They used to be my comfort. Now, they're a source of a quiet, creeping dread. They don't have eyes. I know they don't have eyes, but when I sit here in the quiet of my apartment, I can feel them watching me. I feel them turning on their own stems, their leaves angled towards me, as if I'm now a new source of light, or a new source of food.